Everyone knows James Cameron, the man behind the Terminator, Aliens, Titanic, Avatar, and, surprisingly, one bizarre production disaster that indirectly helped shape his entire future. Before Cameron became James Cameron, there was Piranha II: The Spawning, a movie technically credited to him, but one he hardly got to direct at all. And the strange, borderline absurd story behind that film deserves a closer look. In 1980, producer Ovidio Assonitis made a deal with Warner Brothers to shoot a low-budget horror sequel, Piranha II. Warner handed him $500,000, a surprisingly solid budget for early 80s horror. For context, John Carpenter's Halloween cost less, and Friday the 13th only about $100,000 more. The studio agreed to the funding under one simple condition: the director had to be American. Assonitis didn't mind the rule, mostly because he had already figured out how to cheat it. His usual method was almost elegant in its simplicity: hire an unknown American as the official director, start production, fire him within a week, and then quietly take over the film himself. He'd done it before, and he intended to do it again. His first official director on Piranha II was Miller Drake. Unfortunately for Drake, he made the mistake of displaying an actual opinion on set, which Assonitis didn't appreciate. So Drake was removed almost immediately, barely long enough to find the craft services table. That's when Assonitis offered the directing job to James Cameron, who at that point was only hired to build the rubber piranhas. And just like that, Cameron's directing career technically began, with a movie about flying, carnivorous fish, except he wasn't really allowed to direct anything. From day one, Cameron and Assonitis clashed on everything. Cameron hated the producer's ideas, and Assonitis couldn't see any talent in this random young guy. Lance Henriksen later shared a story about a day on set when he and Cameron were almost sliced in half by a helicopter rotor. Cameron was so terrified that he apparently dropped an expensive camera straight into the water. After 2 weeks of constant arguments and set chaos, Cameron was fired. Assonitis then crowned himself director, producer, and screenwriter all at once, a one-man filmmaking army. But Cameron didn't take the dismissal quietly. Since the production didn't plan to remove his name from the credits, he still felt personally attached to the project. So when he heard shooting had wrapped, he scraped together his last remaining dollars and flew to Rome, where Assonitis was editing the film. For several days, Cameron would sneak into the editing room whenever the producer was gone, secretly recutting the footage and trying to reshape the movie into something he could live with. His version might have actually survived, but eventually security caught him, and Assonitis quickly reversed every edit Cameron made. Cameron considered suing, but he had spent all his money on the Rome trip and was literally living off leftovers from the hotel restaurant. Lawyers were out of the question. According to legend, the hunger and fever that hit Cameron in Rome triggered the nightmare imagery that later evolved into the Terminator. Feverish and half-starved, he kept dreaming about relentless metal creatures hunting him, dreams he would eventually turn into a script. Years later, after Cameron became a major Hollywood force, thanks to the Terminator, Aliens, and The Abyss, the studio gave him the chance to assemble his own cut of Piranha II. He accepted, and his version was released in a few international markets. You can still find it today if you know where to look. But the widely distributed version, the one most people know, is the Assonitis cut, where Cameron's fingerprints are almost non-existent. Cameron now talks about the film with a laugh. In interviews, he jokingly calls Piranha II the best movie ever made about flying killer fish, and says that with a case of beer, it's honestly not that bad. So how does this odd little disaster connect to Cameron praising Genisys and Dark Fate? The answer is surprisingly straightforward. The story of how the first Terminator was made is well known, but people often overlook one crucial detail. Without Arnold Schwarzenegger, the movie either wouldn't have happened at all or would have been made on a tiny budget, turning it into something completely different. Cameron's initial idea, with Lance Henriksen as the Terminator, was rejected by the studio. They wanted a star, and they brought in Arnold. To Arnold, Cameron was nobody, a guy whose only directing credit was the flop Piranha II. If Arnold hadn't liked Cameron personally, or hadn't trusted him, or simply didn't want to work with a director whose one film was a disaster, the studio wouldn't have funded the project. Arnold was already a recognizable star. Not massive yet, but big enough that the studio was willing to finance the movie specifically because of him, not Cameron. And yet, Arnold, after seeing Cameron's storyboards and talking with him, believed in him. Not only did he agree to work with Cameron, he even agreed to play the villain, despite originally being courted for the role of Kyle Reese. If Arnold hadn't given Cameron that chance, what would have happened? Cameron's resume at the time consisted of one infamous flop and the script for Rambo 2, for which he later received a Golden Raspberry Award. Yes, Stallone rewrote most of it, but nobody cared about the fine print. Would Cameron still have become James Cameron after that? In a perfect world, maybe. But realistically, with Piranha 2 and a Razzie to his name, he might have disappeared into obscurity. Instead, Schwarzenegger's support launched Cameron's career into orbit. Cameron's gratitude toward Arnold has always been obvious. He's even made movies simply because Arnold asked him to. True Lies exists because Arnold brought him the idea and asked him to make it. Cameron tossed out the script Arnold handed him, wrote a brand new one, and directed an entirely different film, and because Arnold wanted him to. And that's why, with the modern Terminator films, Cameron simply can't say no. If you listen closely to his interviews between the polite praise for the new sequels, he always slips in a reminder, "I'm only here because of Arnold Schwarzenegger." And one last fun detail, the idea of facehuggers jumping great distances in Aliens, Cameron borrowed it straight from Piranha 2. He's mentioned that more than once. That was Frameback. See you on the next Rewind.